taking a minute and asking yourself, where does this help my relationships? And where does it actually break down my relationships? If you ask yourself that question, then you're going to use the tools thoughtfully, right? Because every tool, I think, has an upside and a downside. And I think we have to look at both and then use it the way that's going to strengthen our relationships, and maybe understand sometimes where it can help, where it's not helpful, and then actively address it.
Hi, I'm Jim McCann, founder of 1-800-Flowers. We created this podcast to share the wonderful people we get to interact with, we get to meet, we get to know, and most importantly, get to learn from. So I invite you to join us on this journey here on the Celebrations Chatter podcast. I'm here today with Lakshmi Rengarajan. I met Lakshmi some years ago, back before COVID. So you have friends who were either during COVID, after COVID, or before, year before. And you were doing an interesting job at the time. You were with WeWork, and you were in charge in culture and environment. And I thought that was an interesting role, and you were learning so much there. And we've had you on stage at our Worth Economy event in Half Moon Bay. And I heard you recently on a different podcast, Scott Galloway's podcast, and you were talking about what you're doing now, which I think is really interesting and right up our alley in terms of things that we're interested in here at the Flowers Companies, in terms of relationships, friendships, and all different kinds of relationships. And your focus recently, it seems, on dating later in life, not your teens, 20s, or 30s, but 40s, 50s, and beyond. How did you get interested in this area, and what are you doing in the field?
First of all, it's so good to see you again. Like, I know we saw each other a couple of months ago, and I'm like always so grateful that Techonomy brought us together. And I just want to say you were, one of the first people that saw that what I was doing at WeWork, it is actually worth having someone whose sole focus is helping people develop relationships at work.
Boy, it sure is. And having all that skill and experience as a bartender really trained you well for that work.
Yeah. No, but I really appreciated that about you, because I think a lot of people were like, wait, that's your job? And I was like, yes, that's my job. It's not something I do on the side. It's not just, I'm not just the person that is, coincidentally social. No, 100% of my job was helping people develop relationships at work. And I hope that becomes a more common thing now, that every company has that person on staff.
I think the need is certainly there, Lakshmi. And I think more and more people are realizing, especially in remote work environments, hybrid work environments, but not just, that relationships that happen at work are just as important as all the other kinds of relationships we have in our life, maybe even more so because of the amount of time we spend working.
Yes. And I think, work relationships, I know that, some people have mixed feelings about it, but when I think about, these are the people I've stood up at their weddings. These are people who've been there for me through the best moments and some of the worst moments. Because at work, for all of the flaws, I think sometimes you really get to see multiple sides of a person, right? You get to see how they take their coffee. You get to see them under stress. You get to see them, are they someone that helps other people? And there is something, so special about that. And I know that has changed for a lot of people abruptly in the past 5 years. Some for good reasons. And I think what you're alluding to is, I think things change so dramatically overnight, and we're still trying to pick up the pieces and figure out where do we get our connection from.
And it's never going back in the bottle, right?
No, it's definitely not going back in the bottle. But I think what we can is we can figure out a new way to drink, right? We can figure out new ways. And so, as you know, I started a lot of my work. I started as a bartender. I worked in the dating industry for a long time. And then I was focused on work relationships. And now I've returned back to dating. And you asked me, why did I focus on people in their 40s and 50s specifically? And I think it's because it's actually a very overlooked demographic. When we think about dating, we either think of the very young person who's in their 20s or 30s and they're looking for a mate and they're trying to build a life. And then sometimes we kind of jump to people, more like in their 70s and 80s. And I think sometimes we forget this middle group. And, there's a lot of different reasons for being single in your 40s and 50s. I think we forget that. Some people are divorced. Some people didn't get married. Some people met a great partner, but they kind of outgrew the relationship. And so there's so many different reasons. And so we don't really talk about the unique benefits and challenges with dating at this point in life. And so I really wanted to take all of my years of experience working in dating in the workplace and really focus on this group.
I'm guessing that some of the motivation for later dating, as you call it, and I think that's a clever term, isn't just mating. It's relationships, it's friendships. Is it always about a fairly traditional romantic relationship, or is it sometimes I just want to have a breath of friends?
Yeah, no, I think that's a really good question. So one of the things that I speak about a lot when I'm talking to corporations or different community groups is don't think of dating as something that only single people do. It's not. Dating is just the art and skill of getting to know people. It's those early interactions. And you're probably going to do that for your whole life. So it's actually like a skill worth really thinking about and cultivating, regardless of your relationship status. So yes, I am talking to people in the context of romance, but I have a lot of listeners that listen to it just for the human connection skills and the reminders of what it takes to get to know somebody.
We just had this conversation among some friends over the weekend, and saying, we lost a friend of ours. She passed, and I see how tough it is on her husband who survived her. We had someone else we were afraid we were going to lose, and she's now doing well. But it just reminded all of us how fragile things are and how important relationships are to us, and how if you don't have a strong support community, those times can be devastating.
Yeah, absolutely. What I'm feeling right now, like you're talking about being around your friends, and I don't know how you feel right now, but like my best friend happens to be in town tomorrow for work, and she's going to make time for me, and we're going to grab dinner. And I think I'm just holding on to everyone just a little bit more tightly right now, because I knew them from before the internet in many cases, or before the internet really took over. And that's another really interesting thing about focusing on people in their 40s and 50s. I'm not trying to pit the generations against each other. That's not it at all. However, it is really easy to forget that if you're in your 40s or 50s, you have a set of skills that is extremely valuable right now. Right? You know probably how to be at a party and not know anyone. You probably may know, or at least you can try and remember what it was like to not have a phone. And so I love reminding people of all of the mannerisms and traits that they picked up just by virtue of when they were born.
At Worth Media, we partnered with BCG recently, the Boston Consulting Group, and 1-800-Flowers to do research among an important audience for us, millennials. First of all, we took a slice of millennials, but we took the affluent slice. And what we were looking for to find out what their thoughts and attitudes were about different subjects, about work, about this idea of work-life balance, family priorities, how they decide on the brands they're going to frequent, the places they frequent, how they make friends, who they choose to invest time and effort into friendship with, how they think about philanthropy. Really, really interesting stuff. But what I found most interesting was how the importance they placed on a few very close, good friends. And that wasn't surprising, but it was profound how it came off. For example, in philanthropy, while they're wealthy by any standards, they're not very liquid in this accumulation part of their life. And so their attitude about philanthropy was the most valuable thing that they had was their time. And so their first choice was to give their time to causes that were important to them. And they all talked about how it's also a way to spend time with and develop new time with friends or develop new friends. So they're mixing and matching their interest in what they perceived as essential to their good mental health, which was having a good set of meaningful relationships. So they tied their philanthropic activities into nurturing those relationships or developing new ones.
The thing that I am trying to address and that I'm so passionate about, and clearly you are also passionate about, is I think there's a very, very clear yearning. People want to have friends. People want to feel connected. I think where we're lacking sometimes is the how. And I think that is what a lot of the work that I did was at WeWork. Like, we can talk about connection, we can talk about community, but if we don't have a plan for it, we've just sort of announced that this thing is really important, but we aren't helping people acquire that thing, right? And so that's why I feel the same thing about like dating. We tell people that finding a great partner is really important. We tell people about, how wonderful it is to love someone, but we don't actually provide a whole lot of support or guidance on how to go about and do that. And so I think that's where, a lot of my work is around, okay, well, how do you date? How do you date in 2024 as a 49-year-old, 52-year-old? And then at work, yes, everybody wants to have really strong relationships, but how do we do that? How do we start to form that? And that's why, I believe very deeply in really setting up structures, really setting up rituals, setting up programming and events.
And that's on behalf of employers and organizations both. So I would say, like, we have a charity called Smile Farms. It's undeniable there's a big social component to what we do. We do fundraisers throughout the year. And with my flowers hat on, it's been so beneficial to flowers because the young people who work for us, who we were told were going to be self-centered and wouldn't give their time, au contraire, they give their time generously. Anytime we run an event, whether it's a golf event or a dinner or lunches, or we do these things called sip and serve, where you learn how to do floral arranging and you have wine. It's usually at someone's house. It's a fun. It's more of a friend raiser than a fundraiser, but there's a big social element. And the young people at Flowers volunteer their time to work on all those events all the time. And I said the beneficial effect of that, Lakshmi, is we attract the kind of people who have that kind of caring about them. And they bring their friends along. And all of a sudden, 2 months later, I say, didn't I meet you at our last Smile Farms event? Yes, I went with my friend, and now I work here too. It has this social construct benefit of creating social events for all our young people to do. If I'm sitting next to someone at a check-in table at a golf event and work with them for a few hours straight there, I get to know them very quickly. And it would have taken months, if ever, for me to get them to know in the office environment that well. But now we have a special bond. I see them, we're waving, how you doing, how's your weekend? So there's a social benefit to that volunteering. When you say build a construct and a plan, I assume you're talking about from an employer's perspective. But what's our responsibility as individuals, as family members, team members, to have a construct and a plan for relationships separate from our work responsibilities?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. I think the biggest thing to remember is that, like, when we gather now, like when we get together, to just take a minute to think about, like, what do you want the outcome to be? It sounds so obvious, but a lot of people don't think about that, and then once you think about that, that's going to affect the table arrangement. That's going to affect the food choices. That's going to affect, how loud the music is. Where is it at? And so all of those elements are things that all of us need to be thinking about right now. In the context of dating, I talk about this. I think I've talked about this with Scott Galloway, actually. Sometimes when we're trying to introduce, two people to each other, we can say something just like, oh my God, you need to meet, Jim. He's amazing. And that's really nice, but there's nothing really for anyone to hook onto, right? It's much more powerful to actually tell them a really short story or a really short anecdote about why you think Jim is so amazing. And I mean, I actually I kind of opened up with it, Like, I remember that you did not think, when we first met, you did not think that my job was ridiculous. It made perfect sense to you. You were like, wait, your job is to help people make connections and friendships and relationships at work. And most people would be like, what? What? And you were like, why isn't every company doing that?
Especially at the WeWork environment where there was episodic presence and not the cohesive one company kind of theme. So you trying to create an atmosphere that was attractive for people because they felt warm and comfortable and connected was important to your business. And you're saying it's important to every business, whether it's WeWork or it's Colgate-Palmolive.
I think it is the most important thing. From the moment people are onboarded, they're starting to figure out who are their relationships going to be. Are they, who's going to be distributed, who's going to be in person. And I don't think people really had to think about those things before. And so I think we need to give them like frameworks to understand that your work relationships have really changed. And how can we help you, plan for it, be mindful of it, and how to use all of these modern tools in a way that feel right for you. Like, I don't think we really think about these tools. They're wonderful, but they have downsides and they have upsides.
Hi, I'm Jim McCann.
And I'm George Everly Jr.
During the COVID-19 epidemic, I stumbled upon an article that Dr. George wrote, which had a real strong impact on me in terms of how COVID was and was likely to impact our social connections, our relationships. And it really, really resonated with me. So I reached out to George, basically wrote him a fan letter, and that began our relationship.
We found a mutual interest in helping people become their best selves, especially in times of adversity.
Together, we embarked on a quest to co-write Lodestar. That journey began with countless hours of researching the most impactful self-help books out there.
Once we had our picks, we combined the science with the practical.
The result of our journey, the creation of a one-stop shop for the best of the best in self-help.
We decided to write this book to help others go from where they are to where they want to be and be the best possible selves they could be.
So if you're looking to boost your career, build stronger relationships, or simply become the best version of yourself, Lodestar is here to guide you on your path.
Now, the aforementioned Scott Galloway has a new book out, and he's very concerned about what's happening to young people as a result of the structures in our culture and in our society and our government framework. And he's particularly concerned about young men and their feeling of a lack of place in this world, that we've been so focused on creating equal opportunity that perhaps we've disadvantaged some young men in terms of the relationship schemes. He talks about how many of them are opting to choose not to date and not to be involved with women and to sort of pull into their shell. And he thinks it's a consequence of some of the backlash from the sense that relationships are inappropriate at work and not being able to, if you ask somebody out and they said no, is that stalking? Is that permitted? So there's a lot of confusion. I think he's right on so many things, but on this one in particular, I think he's very right that it's confusing and disorienting, especially I think for young men right now.
Yes, no, I absolutely think so. I think it's actually confusing for a lot of different people, and I absolutely would include men. And so one of the things that's just so important to understand is all of this shifted really quickly in the past few years. So let's just take I'm just going to talk about modern dating for a second, because I feel like this illustrates the point. Something like the dating apps, which have infiltrated so many people's lives.
Absolutely. I hear it all the time at work. How'd you meet? Oh, and it used to be people wouldn't disclose if they met online. Now it's, we met online dating.
Yes. And there's a lot of great things that have happened because of that. But sometimes we forget these, like dating apps in particular, they're only 12 years old.
Is that all?
That's it. Online dating has been around since the 90s, but dating apps where it was on your phone.
Oh, yeah. Okay.
That is only about 12 years old.
And you had a stint at Match.com, correct?
I did. Yes, I was there. But I think sometimes we forget that our relationships and how we found people and how quickly we found people really changed overnight. And nobody prepared anybody for this, right? I think everyone said, oh, it's going to be really easy. It's going to be on your phone. You can carry it in your pocket. But there are a lot of consequences that come with any change, any progress, any innovation.
What are some of the consequences?
Well, all of a sudden, there are thousands of people in your pocket. Let's just start there.
It seems there's 1,000 people trying to get into our pockets every day.
Right. I mean, there's just people have never just been accessible in the same way. And so, just imagine that's going to change how you focus. That's going to change how many people you're talking to at once. And one of the consequences, there are so many, but one of the things that you hear a lot from people is that sometimes people can be treated as disposable, right? So if there's one bump in the road, one misunderstanding.
The whole idea is swiping right, swiping left, huh?
Well, I mean, very specifically when people meet, if something goes wrong, if there's a miscommunication or a misunderstanding, it can be easy to discard somebody because it feels like, well, there are just hundreds of more people out there. Yeah. And so, that, like you said, what are the consequences? Well, that's just one tiny consequence, but it has massive repercussions, right? If you start developing the habit of leaving anytime there's a challenge or anytime there's, a conflict to work through, well, that's, that doesn't bode very well.
It creates a bad behavior pattern.
Yes, exactly. So back to what you were saying, about Scott Galloway and about some of the impact that it's had on men. I don't think we've ever taught people, when you meet someone that you don't know at all and you met them on the internet, essentially, how are you going to, if you miscommunicate or misunderstand each other, how do you navigate that? And so I think a lot of people have, sometimes they may not know how to do this, and then they may feel badly. And so it's just easier to not do anything than to do something.
In the work that you're doing with later dating, you said earlier on, it's not just about a romantic interest. I thought that the service meetup was a great idea because it gave people a chance to connect on reasons other than a romantic connection. And I think it worked to some extent, but it really didn't fulfill the role I thought it could. And maybe it will yet. But I thought that was an interesting opportunity. What are you finding in terms of people just wanting to have, let's say, I'm sure it's very different, but let's say for a lady, she wants to make a couple of one friend, a couple of friends. How does she go about that? She's 50 years old and she's a professional, so she has a pretty full business life. How do you see them finding success in developing new relationships? And what I know you've coached so many, how do you coach people in that circumstance in terms of how to invest and take chances to develop that friend or two or three that they'd really like to have?
At a very basic level, I think one of the most simple things that you can do is to establish a regular ritual with the person or people that you really want to build a relationship with. I think one of the features of today is that people have friends all over, right? They've got the college friends, they've got the friends from work, they've got their neighbors, some people they met in a Facebook group. And that's really wonderful. But I've noticed that a lot of people are also like, I don't know where to direct my attention. And so one of the things I say is to really focus on a few relationships that you can embed a ritual in. And a great example of that is my two best friends. One lives in Chicago and one lives in Indiana. And I live here in New York. Every single Sunday evening for, I think, 7 or 8 years, we have a call, the three of us. And we do that every week. And sometimes we've skipped it because someone has, a sick child or someone has a deadline. But without fail, we will talk every single Sunday night.
That's a great idea.
And it doesn't have to be, it can be 20 minutes, it can be an hour, but we catch each other up.
But it's a touchstone in your life. You know it's going to be there.
It is. And we also have a rule that there doesn't need to be anything important going on for us to talk. So you can be cooking dinner, you can be folding laundry, you can do whatever it is that you need to do, but we need to check in. Because sometimes I think that people see their friends or feel like they need to reach out when they have a good reason. And that's why a ritual is really important. A ritual happens regardless of whether there's a strong reason.
I heard on that point, I heard Simon Sinek recently talking about friendship. And he said he has several friends. I got the impression it was 8, 9, or 10 friends that he could call when he needed help on something. But there's only 1 or 2 that he would call to share some good news and not be afraid of being perceived as bragging or showing off. I thought that was an interesting way to think about your friendships and to delineate where the deepest and best relationships are.
Yeah, no, I think that's a really, really good point. And I think that's sort of like kind of what I'm saying. You want to have friends that you're even sharing the mundane with. It doesn't always have to be meaningful. And that's why sometimes we will be on the phone and we will all be folding laundry or just doing something. And that is just as important as like a big life event. We're just sort of shooting the breeze. And so I would say, to answer your question, don't always wait for some meaningful moment. Establish a ritual and make sure that you're sharing just the boring stuff, the boring everyday things, as much as the big milestones.
That's really good advice. I see in my grandson, he was on the floor doing his homework, and he had his iPad nearby. And I was nearby reading the newspaper, and it must have been 8 or 9, 10 minutes. All of a sudden, I hear another voice, and I'm looking. I'm saying, "There's no one else here. It's just my grandson." He had a group. There were about 5 buddies. All online doing their homework. They weren't jibber jabbering. They were just there for one another. And every once in a while, someone would say, "Hey, did you see Prodlo on the bottom of page 6? Did you get that?" "Yeah, I got it." It's like they were with one another in the same room studying together. But they weren't. They were digitally connected, which brings me to this question. There's been a lot of criticism of the impact of social media, and indeed, I'm sure it's warranted, and I've seen it. But on the other hand, someone my age, 106 years old, the internet has been nothing but good in terms of my relationships, in that I can stay connected much more easily. I have a handful of text groups that we connect with all the time. We'll share a joke we came across or a meme or something. It's very beneficial to me in terms of maintaining a larger and more broad group of relationships, some of which are friendships, because of the tool there for me. Now, in terms of young people and their pre-fascination and consumption of social media, I understand it being horrible. But in the world that you're talking about, where you can get on the phone every Sunday night with your 2 besties, whether it's do you do that just on a phone line, or do you do it in a FaceTime, or what tool are you using?
We do FaceTime.
So I think there's, it's easy to say it's all bad. I don't think it is, but certainly there's been a lot of good about the impact on social media and relationships too.
Yes. And I think that's always the thing with everything. I think taking a minute and asking yourself, where does this help my relationships? And where does it actually break down my relationships? If you ask yourself that question, then you're going to use the tools thoughtfully, right? Because every tool, I think, has an upside and a downside. And I think we have to look at both and then use it the way that's going to strengthen our relationships, and maybe understand sometimes where it can help, where it's not helpful, and then actively address it, if that makes sense.
The clients that you work with, do you advise in your private coaching practice, do you advise people to have a written plan of the relationships they want to invest in? I have a partner named Dr. George Everly, and he's counseled us to work with our community of the celebrations community. And in the beginning of the year, we said, look, you're going to make resolutions around diet, exercise, what you're going to read, what you're going to study. Why don't you make one around relationships? So we divided it into 3 groups. Relationships you have that you want to continue to invest in. Relationships that have maybe waned a bit over the years. And maybe there's 8 of those, and till you decide, I want to reinvest in those. So those are important to me, and they could and should be again. And relationships, maybe they're work relationships or community relationships that you don't have, that you want to be deliberate about trying to develop. Invite somebody to a book signing you're going to arrange to get together for a cup of coffee, dropping them a note about complimenting on something that you've seen that they achieved and you wanted to recognize them, but being deliberate. Do you recommend that for your clients?
Yes, 100%. Depending on the kind of person I'm talking to, I'll use either it's a portfolio, it's a cake, it's, a tapestry, whatever imagery works best for somebody. And then how are you going to cultivate that, right? Like, because some people don't even have that base layer of strong friendships and they need to start there. And other people, all of their friendships are, maybe like decades old. And what they're missing is actually more of the acquaintance or the new friend. And so it's worth, I'm completely agreeing with you. But I think when people just say, I want to develop my relationships, that doesn't really give you a roadmap and that doesn't really like fire you up, right? It doesn't really give you an emotional compass.
So what do you recommend they do?
So I think first, really understand what is it that relationships are bringing to your life that you don't currently have. It sounds really sort of obvious, but a lot of people sometimes they want something, but they haven't really identified why it's important to them, and getting very, very clear about that. And then from there being like, well, what kinds of like, who's in the mix? Who's already in the mix? And then building on what you said, what are the relationships? Like I use the word resurrect. Like some of them have, you've lost touch with somebody, or maybe there was a miscommunication. There are also relationships that in today's world need to be repaired. Like something happened, there was a rupture, there's relationships to repair. Then there's ones you want to move. Maybe they're acquaintances and you want to move them into a friendship or a deeper friendship. So it's really worth it. I'm agreeing with what you said, to kind of do like inventory and understand who's in your life and what do you want relationships to be in your life? And then what are you going to do to actually bring those people closer?
We had a chat in the office this morning, standing around, we're getting a cup of coffee or tea, and we were chatting with a couple of young folks in the office. And I said to them, I recently heard that the amount of drinking in young people, let's call it Generation Z, is down like 20% over where it was for the millennials. As someone who's expert in the area, having been a professional bartender and a social media expert and a dating and relationship expert, do you see that? And is that a good thing? Is it, what do you think the trend is there?
I think it's interesting. I think there's an awareness that alcohol may not be the best thing for you. So I would never say to anyone that alcohol is in any way like a necessary way to meet people. I think what it is like the rituals are changing.
Yes. And you've mentioned rituals several times, and rituals in several different forms are key to all thinking around these subjects.
Yeah, exactly. And I think depending on when you grew up and what was happening around you, the ritual was getting a drink after work or going to a work dinner. And now, you said your grandson is developing a ritual of, just working on screen with his friends. With social media, there's been a lot more, I think, awareness of, people asking, why do we do that? Like, why do we all, gather around, a bottle of wine or a bar? Are there other ways for people to get together? So I think it's really great. And I also think, opening a bottle of wine at dinner is also great too. But I'm very happy to see that we are expanding the ways that people think, we should gather. I think that's wonderful.
And let's get back to the later data crowd. What are you seeing there? How are people finding one another? How are you working with that community?
I love seeing people rediscover themselves in this way, right? There's I think for a lot of things in life, there's, if you want to lose weight, if you want to start investing, there's kind of like, a lot of people to give you, a roadmap. I think for dating, it feels a little bit, fraught and a little bit new. And so I really like reminding people that a lot of the skills that it takes to date, you have them. You just haven't thought about them in a while. And so I think that to me is really exciting. And I think one of the best parts about working with people in their 40s or in 50s is that they have so many stories and they forget because they've been, in many cases, they haven't really thought about, well, how do I package this in the context of dating? And I think people are always so surprised when I'm like, wait, you did what? Wait, I'm sorry, excuse me. You built what business? Wait, you raised how many kids? Your parents gave you this, and they have never thought about it.
I didn't think it would be interesting to anyone else.
Yes, they've never thought about it in the context of how would that help me connect someone in dating. And I think a lot of the dating advice that you hear is directed at young people. And it's very much about like, who am I going to become? What do I want to do in the future? And so sometimes I think we leave out, what does it mean to really talk about your past in an exciting, hopeful, future forward way?
Yeah.
And so that is one of the things that I think people in their 40s and 50s can kind of forget. They can sometimes get sometimes a little too hung up on their past that they're not always sure how to talk about the future. And so that is one of the things that I love bringing to my clients and to my listeners.
I've heard you say before that particularly among later daters, that it's important to start out with a foundation of friendship.
Not necessarily.
No?
No. I mean, people date for all sorts of reasons. Mm-hmm. So I think what is interesting is I think that later daters have a lot of very strong friendship skills that they haven't necessarily realized or tapped into.
And that's where your work helps them to think about it and have a plan like they should for everything else in their life, huh?
Yeah. And I think just for the biggest thing I like to remind people is that for a lot of the people that I work with, they haven't sometimes dated in 10, 15, 20, 25 years. Dating later in life is different. And you have to reimagine it. And you have to date for who you are now and how the world is now. Not who you were when you were 24 or 30 or whatever, but for who you are now. And I think that is one of the most exciting things to remind people.
I think that's so important. Is there a dating site that focuses on this later dater community?
Yeah, but I wouldn't recommend it. There's not necessarily a particular dating app or anything that I would recommend to people. I think the most important thing is to actually prepare yourself for what it means to date now. Like depending on my clients, like once I get to know them, I might be like, you know what, I think this one might be better for you and maybe you belong over here. And it might be at different points. Like if they're freshly single, it's going to be different than what I would say if they've been single for 5 years, right? So I'm going to point them in different directions. But it's not necessarily the app itself. It's changing your entire orientation and what you think dating means and how it is that you're going to get to know people at this point in your life. And also to pace yourself. I think that's one of the things that I think a lot of people want this to happen very quickly and they want it.
What do you mean pace yourself? Okay, so you meet someone, you go out, you have a cup of coffee, you say, geez, I'd like to see this person again. Don't make it later that afternoon.
Well, that's one way to pace yourself. I think what I mean by pace yourself is that it's not going to, I think people want to, in some cases, be in a relationship as quickly as possible. And that's not, I mean, I understand it, but I think I want people to actually enjoy being single. And I think it's a step that a lot of people forget. There's a lot to enjoy. There's a lot to discover about yourself when you're single. And I never want people to miss that chapter.
So, Lakshmi, what should we look for next from you? What are you working on? What will we be watching from this island and cheering for you about?
Thanks for asking that. I mean, two things is I'm very passionate about the later dater today. I have the podcast. But the other thing that I'm spending a lot of my energy on is I'm speaking at companies and banks and corporations to employee bases with companies that want to make relationship building a focus. And they've been talking about it for years, but they haven't really provided a lot of guidance or how. And I come in and I bring in frameworks that I learned from my years working in dating and how to apply those to the modern work relationship. And that has been probably the most transformative thing that I've been doing now, is literally teaching people how to quote unquote date, which is just how do we get to know people, but in the context of work, which is what I was doing at WeWork. So I've been kind of going back to that work recently.
And how might an HR person, a senior leader, how might they get in touch with you to find out about working with you?
Yeah. So my website, I know I don't have the easiest name, but I also have a name that hopefully once you learn, you won't forget. But it's LakshmiRengarajan.com. And on my website, I have, all the information about what you can expect and where I've spoken, and really how you can start to teach your people to have their own plan for how they're going to build connection and relationships, both inside and outside of work.
So for those who are challenged with spelling, as I would be here, LakshmiRengarajan.com.
Yeah, I think it's better people just follow the link.
And it'll be in the notes from this show. Lakshmi, so nice to connect with you. Such an upbeat spirit. You have a wonderful way of approaching everything. I'm sure you're a great friend. I'm sure people who are friends with you really value that, and we can tell by your energy and your compassion. So thanks for sharing your ideas with us today, and we look forward to hearing from you again and shining a light on your next book and your next business.
Thanks, Jim. Thank you so much for having me on. And thank you for that first time we met and not thinking that my job title was silly.
I was intrigued then. I'm more intrigued now. Thanks, Lakshmi.
Thank you.
We put our heart into everything we do. We are farmers, bakers, florists, and makers who grow and create with a passion. Made with love at every step of the way. Because at the end of the day, we know you're sending more than a gift. 1-800-Flowers, share with love.
Well, I hope you enjoyed what you heard, and I know I'll be sharing it forward. I hope you get to as well. Let's keep the conversation going. Follow me along on Twitter at Jim1800Flowers and on LinkedIn at Jim McCann. Hope to talk to you soon.